Hello, everyone. Welcome back to 21st Century Renaissance. I'm your host, Dr. Michael Opiano, and I'm joined by my guest today, Eddie Zapata of Aristos Books. Eddie is going to be joining us today. He's going to tell us a bit about his experience teaching Western tradition in high school, his experience reading and studying philosophy, history, and culture of Western civilization for many years. And he's also going to tell us a bit about his most recent publication, The West is the Light, published by Aristos Books. Eddie, welcome. Thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Michael, for having me.
Yes, of course. How are things out there in Colorado? Do I understand correctly? You're tuning in from Louisville, Colorado. Is that correct?
Louisville. They pronounce it differently than the Kentucky
Louisville.
Pronunciation. Yeah, things are wonderful here. Colorado's a beautiful state. I'm not from here. I'm from Chicago. But as a kid who grew up in the inner city, a concrete jungle, I'm very happy to be exposed to nature here in Colorado. It's a very outdoorsy, very beautiful state.
Yes, yeah. My grandmother, actually, on my mother's side, was from Colorado. She moved to California for a very short period of time, where she met my grandfather while he was going out to fight in the Pacific War during World War II. Wow. He walked up to her on the street in San Francisco and asked her out to dinner, and they got married during the course of the war, and then came back to Connecticut, where I was from.
Wow.
But if there was one thing that she used to say that she always missed, it was the mountains. Growing up alongside the mountains in Colorado. So wonderful. So Eddie, I'm very curious to hear more about your perspectives on Western culture and Western tradition. You spent at least 8 years of your career teaching Western literature, philosophy, history at the high school level. You've begun to stake out a career as an author in this area. But to get things started today, I'm very interested on this particular remark that you have on your website. And you mention here, I see now that it is not a given that the West will endure, at least not in any healthy or recognizable manner. Would you be able to tell us a bit more about this? Would you be able to elaborate on this idea for us a bit? What did you mean by this?
Well, I think it's no secret that we live in a society that is quite chaotic right now. And when I say society, I'm referring to the West. So let me back up a little bit and let me define what I mean by the West. The West means Western civilization, of course. But what does that mean? It means European culture, and more broadly speaking, the countries that were the children of Europe, you might say. So in North America, we have the US and Canada. Over in the Southern Hemisphere, we have Australia, New Zealand, South Africa. And arguably, you could say Latin America, but that's a separate conversation.
Okay.
So when I say that, so that's the West. Now, what do I mean by it's not a given that we're going to continue? It's going to continue. We are going through a strange, a quite bizarre moment in Western civilization when we seem to have turned upon ourselves. We're not being attacked by outsiders so much as we are having a crisis of identity. An existential moment when we don't know who we are or whether or not we are worthy of self-respect. We look to our past, and many of us see only evil. We see colonialism. We see a history of slavery, etc. And we, in my opinion, we have been duped by certain forces. I'm not going to get too political. Certain forces to look at ourselves in this negative way. So if half the population in the West thinks so negatively about themselves, then it's not a given that it will perdure, that it will endure. Because if the people themselves don't want to continue to exist, then what's to stop that civilization from going into the dustbin of history?
Yes, interesting. So what would you in this? Okay, so clearly in this framework here, right? Something is going on in terms of, let's say, at least in the context of the United States, but not just localized to the United States. There is, as you said, a crisis of identity. We're not exactly sure, perhaps at a group level, perhaps then for many of us at the individual level, what our place is in our broader culture, or even what our culture is, or what it represents, what its history is, what its values are. What would you say is the genesis of this confusion? I mean, you've mentioned perhaps some maybe some bad actors involved, but is it just a question of a few bad actors, or is this a very recent phenomenon? What sort of timescale are we dealing with here? What's your view of this?
I've tried to identify for myself the origin, and I keep localizing it in certain spots over the past 150 years. But I think if I was going to look at this in the broadest possible historical context, I would perhaps have to go all the way back to the beginning of the so-called Enlightenment period with René Descartes, with this famous "I think, therefore I am." This is when the West began to question the very nature, the very fabric of reality, vis-a-vis God, vis-a-vis other human beings. The next momentous period would be the French Revolution, when an entire country simply said, "We're done with the past. We're going to do a clean break. We're going to kill our king. We're going to kill the aristocracy. We're going to kill the clergy." That was a shock to the European psyche. It still shocks me. It's over 200 years ago. So those two events, the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, but to bring it closer to our own time period, you could also argue, I argue rather, that history is cyclical. Oswald Spengler talks about this, and some other historians talk about this. And they tend to identify, there are often cycles in history which are identified as being, we all know the cliche meme, hard times create good men, et cetera, et cetera. Well, there's something to that. And we in the West have had good times, relatively speaking, for a long time. And I think a strong argument can be made that good times will lead to a kind of lethargy, a kind of laziness, a feeling that things are going to continue fine. The machine's going to continue working no matter what we behave like. So let's behave any way we want to behave. And let's abandon the values of our ancestors because they were just boring, one-dimensional people, and we're hip, we're modern.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay, so something like, right, and this is sort of building into this element of taking things for granted in this particular remark we have, right? So this sort of idea that, I can kind of think of myself even having this viewpoint up into a few years ago that, like, yeah, what do you mean? Everything's always just kind of worked. It always has worked, and it's so good. It'll, like, of course, it's just going to keep working. Things are just going to hold themselves together. Therefore, okay, with my career and my education, or what I'm going to do with my life, I can just go and, I guess, do whatever I want because it's all just going to work, right? So it's whatever kind of makes me feel good, or I feel motivated to do, in the sense of sort of what entertains me, something like that, because everything's a given. It's just going to hold itself together. I have no personal responsibility in that because it's so ironclad. It's just going to hold itself together. I would say I definitely came into contact with reconsidering that viewpoint for myself. Over, well, at least over the past half decade. That wait a second, no, it actually might not, right? It's if I don't do something, right? Because how many people maybe out there are there who, how many people are necessary to hold everything together, and how many people maybe have that call or that realization to do something, and how many people are content to just kind of go, oh, I'll just go with the flow of things as they've gone. So I'm very interested also in this point you have about sort of the cyclical nature of history, but also of this maybe particular phenomenon. So I've been thinking about the Renaissance for some time, and thinking about our time period, right? It's sort of the theme of this podcast, right? Is 21st century Renaissance. Is this idea that Renaissance represents, this is, let's call it the claim or the hypothesis of of the podcast, is that Renaissance is okay. We have a capital R Renaissance, right? We have a historic period we might refer to as the Renaissance, but Renaissance is something like a collective cultural or social or psychological phenomenon, however you'd like to classify it, which is a phase maybe in this cycle of epochs or sort of sub-periods of the life of a culture. And Renaissance is necessary, right? A sort of death, rebirth, and renewal is necessary in order for cultures to survive and continue to adapt to the changing world and nature over time. Let's say that. And so I was particularly interested, say, in the late Middle Ages, as well, in this sort of, in my examination of the historic capital R Renaissance and sort of some of the ideas of the 12th or the 13th century, which preceded the Renaissance. So while you were speaking about, say, the Enlightenment, or at least certain elements of the Enlightenment, it sounds like in particular pointing to the French Enlightenment here, about the French Revolution, right? You mentioned this idea of it no longer being necessary to connect to tradition, to our ancestors, to how culture has developed over time, that suddenly we, being in this particular time period, we have the luxury, because maybe of our prowess or of our superior intelligence, something like that, we can afford to distance ourselves from these things, from these institutions, and in fact destroy them, something like that. I was struck by the degree to which the 12th century author Chrétien de Troyes says this. Yeah, says this in his preface.
Behind me.
Yes, yeah. This is in his preface to the Cligé. He says specifically, right? Once long ago, there was, the height of the Romans and the wisdom of the Greeks philosophers, right? But now the height of learning has come to France, and no one speaks of the Greeks and the Romans anymore, right? So there's this. Is that the sort of phenomenon that you're talking about? Do I understand that correctly? That's the sort of thing, perhaps, that you perceive besetting us today?
Well, I'm not familiar with that quote by Chrétien, but the sentiment he expresses seems to be that we moderns, I'm putting myself back into the century, we moderns can now dispense with the past because we've reached a certain level of sophistication or of
Yes.
evolution, and the past is either irrelevant or mostly irrelevant. I wonder if he said that tongue in cheek or not. But even if he was sincere, the point still stands that he was a Frenchman, a European, a Westerner on European soil, making a statement about the development of his society. So his statement must be looked at. There's a certain legitimacy, whereas today we're so cosmopolitan, we're so multicultural, there's so many outside forces, there's such a movement of peoples that a Westerner today, well, let's take a Frenchman today, 800 years later, who says we can break with our past. I'm not sure that the philosophical underpinnings of a modern Frenchman and Chrétien de Troyes are the same. If the two men, the one real historical and the other hypothetical one, had the same authority, maybe that's the wrong term to make that claim, because Chrétien was certainly a man in the midst of his culture. He was, there were no open borders. It was just the French were French, the Europeans were Europeans. A modern Frenchman today, French woman, whatever, has been their psyche has been exposed to this atmosphere of open borders, of diversity, so I'm not sure if perhaps a modern European has the legitimacy, if that's the right term, to say we can now break from the past, whereas Chrétien was. I don't agree with him. Obviously, I think the Greeks and the Romans have value in every century throughout all time, because they are a distant mirror of ourselves, no matter where we are in time. But anyway, that's my view on that quote.
Okay, great. Yeah, yeah. So right, you've spent, I believe on your website, right, it says you've spent 8 years teaching classical literature, broadly understood from the Western tradition, philosophy, history at the high school level. Through your experience teaching, what would you say are some of the key values or elements of Western culture, perhaps that that we ought to be paying particular attention to? Maybe that we've ceased to give proper attention to, that we've ceased to cultivate perhaps through our education or through our contemporary literature or through our contemporary culture.
I want to clarify one thing. My degree is in history. I have a bachelor's, and I taught world history, mostly world history, U.S. history, and geography and U.S. government, and AP world history. So,
Okay.
so I mean, the class itself was called world history, but I, being very pro-Western, I hit those themes. But of course, we discussed China, we discussed Africa and Latin
Oh,
America.
sure.
But anyway,
Sure.
but to your question. So what are the elements of the West that are perhaps in decay or I've forgotten? I've thought about this a lot, and the first one that comes to mind is a term that is a bit controversial, and it's a bit obscure and requires a bit of explaining, and I'll try to do my best. And that term is individualism.
Okay. Yeah.
Individualism is, before I define it, I want to discuss it as a double-edged sword, or it has been a double-edged sword for Westerners. Because on the one hand, well, okay, let me try and define it. There's a quote that I love by Edith Hamilton, this woman who wrote extensively about the Greeks, and she compared ancient Asiatic societies like Egypt and India with the Greeks. And she said, on the one hand, the Egyptians, the Indians, the Babylonians create these vast soaring structures and these mysterious societies full of mystery, the pharaoh god king and all these sorts of things. But they were moving into a kind of, their focus was moving more internal. It was more a world of the mind, a world that was focused on the next world. Hinduism with its focus on destruction of the ego, the pharaohs on the concentration on the next world, thus mummification was necessary. So she takes that world that was centered more on otherworldly things, and she contrasts that with the Greeks. And the Greeks, by contrast, she argues, enjoyed play. They enjoyed athletics for the sake of athletics. The individual mattered there. She says, we know the names of some Greek peasant in some Athenian story by some Athenian playwright, but we don't know the names of any barbers or peasants or farmers in the Egyptian stories, in the Babylonian stories, in other of the Asiatic societies. So the point here is that the idea of the individual, as we understand him, as an individual who has merit, even though he's not a member of the aristocracy or the priesthood, there's still a certain value to him. There's some spark of logos, of divine spark in all of us. We're not just chattel to build pyramids. And so this was the first blossoming of what I call individualism in the West. And from Greece, it blossomed. It blossomed so much, perhaps, that it's too much at points in history where the average European or Westerner will say, well, what do I care? As long as I'm, as long as you said earlier in our talk, as long as I'm fine, the larger society will just have to make its own way. So on the one hand, it's led to progress, the scientific revolution, industrial revolution, the spirit of conquest that in the poem Ulysses by Tennyson is so beautifully expressed, to seek, to find, never to yield. I'm paraphrasing. That to me gets right to the root of Western individualism. So that's just one element, but I don't want to continue on. But that's perhaps one of the most relevant aspects of the West that is perhaps misunderstood today, or perhaps it's being used against us by us.
Okay, so yeah, all right. So individualism. So yeah, so it sounds here, right, that at the heart of this is something like there is an intrinsic value or an intrinsic worth in, well, in the individual, yes. I mean, but in perhaps every or any human being within a given society. And it sounds like that you're pointing to an expansion of that concept in Hellenic society versus, say, the societies of Egypt, Babylon, India, something like that. Do I understand that correctly?
Right. It was brought to attention first. It was given value, beginning with the Greeks.
Okay, okay. So what would you say are some methods, right? Like in the classroom, what are some things you've used, or what are some things you think we could be doing differently in education to elevate this particular concept of individualism?
Oh well, I think by the time we get to the classroom, several other steps have been skipped over that are necessary.
Yeah, yeah, or before
Um,
there too. Yeah.
because this is a societal thing. Um,
Hmm.
so I think it begins with the first ingredient, the first step for the to restore the West to proper health, as I see it,
Hmm.
is to
Yes.
make Westerners stop being ashamed of themselves. For one thing, there's a sense of shame.
Okay.
There's a term that we use in the U.S. I'm sure you've heard it too. And again, it's a little controversial. I don't want this conversation to get to become a political shouting match, but the term is white guilt. I'll just leave
Okay.
that there.
Yes. No. No. Hey, I've heard that.
Leave that there. And again, that's a byproduct of these political forces that have been these sinister forces over the past several decades that have
Yeah.
planted seeds in the minds of
Mm.
Americans, of Europeans, of Australians, saying, you know, you're really a lousy people. You really don't.
Yeah.
You really shouldn't be proud of anything. Don't you know the bloodshed you've caused? Don't you know
Mm.
how don't you know how uniquely terrible you are in comparison
Yes.
to how noble everyone else's. So I reject that. That's just
Mm.
not true.
Mm.
So, so what do we have to do? That's a big question. Well, what
Hmm.
I'm doing as a writer is I created this work, this book,
Yeah.
which I want to enter into the public consciousness. And the book is a celebration of European culture. So hopefully, in my
Mm.
small way, when someone who is from the West, or not from the West, but an ally of the West, picks up this book
Mm.
and they enter the story through the eyes of this 12-year-old American boy who's discovering the West firsthand, traveling via
Yeah.
a magical history book, they will see history, European history, as I see it, as this
Hmm.
multicolored, multifarious explosion of societies that are
Hmm.
diverse and yet connected by certain traits like individualism, like
Mm.
a questing, a spirit of quest, of
Mm.
an expansion of the spirit. C.S. Lewis talked about
Mm.
northernness, an experience he had as a boy when he
Mm.
saw the artwork of this British artist who was decorating a book of Wagner's operas. And that's what I'm talking about. This spirit of I got to go plant my flag on that mountain over there just because it's there. I don't know
Mm.
what that is, but that's a
Mm.
Western thing. And
Mm.
whether it's a mountain or whether it's the secrets of the atom, we've got to split the atom, boys, because we've got to fight. We've got to figure this out. Again, I return to that theme in the poem Ulysses: to seek, to strive, to find, never to yield. That's the
Mm.
West.
Mm. Okay, so it sounds like perhaps there are maybe two elements there, at least perhaps in that you point to that are perhaps out of sorts with at least modern narratives of Western identity versus historic narratives, or maybe core narratives of who it of what it means to be a part of Western culture and Western civilization. And it sounds like the first of these. Okay, well, the second one is certainly this kind of exploratory spirit, something
Mm.
like that, a spirit of um, creative exploration, something like
Yes.
that, right? Whether it's going and exploring new lands or chasing accomplishment to see what can be done by human beings, right? How far can the human condition be pushed in that sense? Um, yeah, discovery in terms of scientific discoveries, like you said, splitting the atom. But the other, right, okay, so on the one hand, it's this sort of this forward, outward motion, right? This idea of, well, perhaps an earlier idea of perhaps what was understood by the term progress, or progressive, right? In the sense of trying to push the boundaries of the known, trying to push the boundaries of the possible, and committing one's life and one's resources and one's ambitions to that. Now, again, our definition of progress or progressive is well, perhaps a bit regressive, and it seems to be rolling back, right, individual rights as far as for perhaps some groups at the expense of others, or however you want to conceive that. We don't have to go down that road, but just to be clear about how I'm using that term. But the other is also to kind of remove this restraint of a sort of, okay, our past, let's say, right? If you come from a European culture or a Western culture, broadly perceived, right? If you're, whether your skin is white or not, right? The term white is kind of expanding to include people who are, really until recently perhaps would not have been considered to have white skin, but are nonetheless sort of imprisoned under this umbrella of white guilt. Yeah, so sort of removing this kind of default narrative that Western society or Western culture should be always and in all contexts equated with, let's see how some of my former colleagues might put it, a patriarchally imperialistic, colonialist, oppressive culture or society, something like that, right? And of course, that's not to deny that there haven't, if you look at any culture, right, you can find episodes of this, right? I mean,
Right.
there were elements of colonial expansion that were done for personal gain or profit or something like that. But to say that endeavor is actually at the core of Western society seems to be, at least it sounds like in how you're presenting this, something that has entered into a state of excess with respect to the way that, as citizens of a Western civilization, we are reflecting on our own past. Did I understand that correctly?
I think so. Yeah, I think you've encapsulated that correctly.
Great. Yeah. So let's perhaps then talk a bit more about your recent book. So at the end of the year last year, late December, you officially published "The West is the Light," and you've started to talk about this a little bit. Would you be able to share a little bit more with us about your book?
Yes. Several years ago, I sat down and I began. I told myself, after years of telling myself, Eddie, you're going to be a writer, I started writing down ideas. And I have about 90 pages of just ideas, little snippets of conversation, ideas. So The West of the Light is the product of just one line out of 90 pages of ideas. And the story is this: a young boy named Clark is sitting in his room, and he has open on his lap a book. The book is a gift from his grandfather. It is a large, ornate, hardbound book called The Light of Western Civilization. And it's a gift from his grandfather, as I said. And as he's leaning back with the window behind him and water droplets on the window, he flips the pages at random and he sees various colorful illustrations and texts. And what he's looking at are the various elements of the patrimony of Europe: Gothic cathedrals, Joan of Arc, the Spartans fighting to the death of Thermopylae, all of these little milestones of European history, etc. And they fascinate him. Clark is a very sharp boy, and he's the kind of kid who would rather read than go out and do other things. He falls asleep. When he opens his eyes from his nap, in front of him is a mysterious stranger with a Scottish accent. He presents
Mm.
himself as Alistair, and Alistair
Mm.
tells Clark he offers him the opportunity to journey through history by means of the book,
Mm.
which will sort of teleport them throughout history. And after a brief introduction, the two of them begin their journey. Stonehenge is their first stopping point. And after that,
Mm.
they go to many other places. This is just volume one. I hope
Mhm.
to continue with volume two. But they leave suburbia in America and go into prehistoric England, and that's when Clark's journey
Mm.
begins.
Okay, all right. So it's both a journey through time, perhaps, and space with respect to, say, some of the important historical geography of Western culture.
Yes.
Interesting. So, what are your well, number one, I suppose I should ask who is the intended audience of this book? Is this a general audience? Is this a young adult audience? Who did you have in mind, right? Who did you write this for?
Well, I wrote it for everyone, and I wrote when I was asked a specific question by the publisher, who shall
Mhm.
we say this is for? I said young adults, but I only said that
Mhm.
because it involves a young adult, a 12-year-old boy, and it is
Mhm.
kind of a coming of age story.
Mhm.
He goes through various emotional and physical trials because he expresses in the first few chapters this idea that he doesn't like how men are today,
Mhm.
and he feels a
Mhm.
sense of lack, and he says how can I fix this sense of lack? And so Alistair takes that into account, and he puts the boy through a kind of growing up process, a kind of manning the boy up.
Mhm.
So it is for young people in that respect, but also going back to our earlier conversation, it's a book that celebrates the West, and I feel that the West is in a
Mhm.
state of self-sabotage. So if I can just
Mhm.
get people to see the West as I see it, uh,
Mhm.
acknowledging the beauty, the mystery, the
Mhm.
motifs, the cultural motifs that repeat from the time of the earliest the painters of Spain and France and Altamira
Mhm.
down to Napoleon Bonaparte. There's a certain, in
Mhm.
my view, there's a repetition of there's cultural motifs. There's things that repeat. There's a beauty. There's a grandeur there that needs to be recognized and
Mhm.
appreciated.
Interesting. So are the events of the book, is the narrative, some of these, especially these places where your character Clark goes, is this based in part, sort of indirectly on your experience, sort of imbibing Western culture and tradition? Is this based in part on your travels, say, or your experience, your exposure to a certain magical history book?
Well, I discovered the joy of reading when I was about 10 years old.
Mm.
And I had a kind of a seminal experience when I was 10 years old. My mother bought me an
Mm.
encyclopedia set. You're probably too young to know
Okay.
what those are, or to have owned one. But
Oh
my
no, I read the
encyclopedia,
encyclopedia as a kid. I
okay,
did. I did. My
okay.
dad, military encyclopedia. My dad got me.
Oh, okay. So my encyclopedia set came with a 12 volume set of the so-called greatest books. They were called the Harvard Classics,
Mm.
and they were a
Oh yeah.
representation of a larger collection that's called the 5 foot shelf because it was 5 feet when you
Yeah.
stacked all the books. So
Yeah.
my 12 books had authors like Homer, Dante, Cervantes,
Mm. Hmm.
Shakespeare, the Brothers Grimm, 19th century English essayists and poets.
Hmm.
So I was exposed to the Western canon very early on. And although I couldn't always
Mm.
understand what I was reading because of not
Yeah.
just the material, but of the level of writing,
Yeah.
I sensed that I was glimpsing the curtain was being raised, and I was glimpsing another world that, as an inner city kid from Chicago, I had scarcely known existed except for maybe watching PBS specials.
Yeah.
Um, so I felt, first of all, that I don't know who these people are, what that civilization is, but I want to somehow, someday, connect to them because I see beauty in this world that I don't see
Yeah.
in my world. So that was
Yeah.
my introduction to the West, to the Western canon, to European intellectual history, to the elevated arts, you might say, the higher arts of
Yeah.
Europe. So with
Yeah.
that basis, I over my life I built upon that. I have visited some of these places. I went to Stonehenge in
Mm.
2019. It was wonderful. I've been to Spain, but not to Altamira. So the reason I
Mm.
included those places is because for me and for many other people who love the West,
Mm.
I feel that they are touchstones. There's just something,
Mm.
because they're prehistoric, because we don't know who these people were, what they call themselves.
Mm.
They left no written story. It's easy to romanticize them, and I do. I romanticize the Stone Age, the Stonehenge builders, the painters
Mm.
of the Altamira caves in Spain, the Black Forest dwellers in prehistoric
Mm.
Germany.
Mm.
So it's a flight of fancy based on places I've visited and places I've read about.
Okay. Yeah, I love your emphasis on beauty. I can certainly connect to that experience myself when I was growing up. Right, I'm lucky enough to have been through. Yeah, I didn't really have too detailed of a phone until college. So until I was 18. Like I didn't get my first like smartphone until I was 18.
Oh,
There was the internet. I did a lot of, I'll say this, I read a lot of Wikipedia. I did that, right? For all of its faults, it did also provide a lot of entertainment, right? In the days where, if you had a laptop, like my dad would bring around his laptop to work and stuff like that. And, if he was doing something, he'd be like, okay, here's a laptop. And yeah, YouTube was kind of dumb little 3-minute videos. So, that really didn't sustain my attention very much. But Wikipedia really, that's where I would go, and I would, look up historical figures, historical places and things like that. But I can identify with this particular feeling, especially I grew up in Connecticut, just outside New Haven. And yeah, being close to Yale University, especially, right? There are bits of you know Europe that have been tried to have been recreated by that institution, at least aesthetically. But that being said, New Haven, Connecticut, is surrounded by something that I imagine looks probably the closest to inner city Chicago as you could find in the United States, maybe shy of, like, I don't know, Detroit or something like that. But yeah, I was just captivated by this idea that it's like, wait, there are these beautiful places that are where you just walk around and you're surrounded by the memory of this stuff all the time. It's not like, post-industrial hellscape and broken glass on the ground. Like, that's not a thing that they do.
no.
What would it be like to live in a society where that just wasn't what things looked like, and everywhere you looked you were reminded of all of these different layers of the past, even into the dimension of legend?
Right.
So what would you say is something we could do, right? So for maybe our listeners who are thinking about ways maybe that they could introduce a little bit of beauty into their lives, right? If they can't necessarily go and transport themselves across the Atlantic or something like that to get a taste of these great places, at least on where I am now on this side of the Atlantic. Yeah, what are some things they could do? Obviously, they can read your book, but what are some things maybe that you do, that you introduce into your life on a regular basis to get in touch with some of that beauty?
I think if I met one of these hypothetical people, I would begin my conversation like this. I'd say, okay, let's turn away from pop culture. Let's ignore pop music and Hollywood celebrities and all of the current nonsense that America is producing, and let's roll back the centuries, and let's perhaps go to a museum and go to an art museum and look at art from the Renaissance or from the medieval period, or look at 19th century furniture from the Victorian period. So a museum, but before we even go to a museum, I would maybe sit in front of a computer, a tablet, and say, let me navigate to a certain site. Maybe a content creator on X. There are great content creators on X producing images.
Yeah.
And I would start scrolling and say, see this picture? See the elaborate detail of this Napoleonic era salon, or see the detail in this Gothic cathedral, the soaring spires, the flying buttresses. Do you see that? See the beauty, see the attention to detail, see the stained glass windows. I would try to, in that way, awaken that sense of beauty that perhaps has been deadened, or that has perhaps been sabotaged by this idea that no, that's from the West, and it bears some sort of evil stamp for being Western, and we've got to only focus on what Hollywood produces. So I think the visual arts are perhaps the strongest way to go, because when there's no denying, unless you're absolutely dead inside, that these things I've been describing impart a sense of great beauty, of the sublime. So I would start with visual beauty.
So to start with visual beauty, it sounds especially like architecture, to point out excellence in attention to detail, excellence perhaps in something like vision, the ability to project some of these great projects of design, and to emphasize the great, perhaps mastery or dedication it may have taken, and the amount of time perhaps to develop the ability to even create something of this that is so reflective of natural beauty, but having been created by human hands, something like that.
I think so. I think someone said architecture is poetry. Perhaps you know the quote. I can't quite remember now. It's frozen poetry or something along those lines, or it's the sum of all the arts.
Yeah, it's, well, I remember this quote by I think is it related to Hugo's preface to The Hunchback of Notre Dame? Well, that he is usually quoted as his lament over the death of architecture as a representational medium, right? He lamented the transition of the conveying of information through the symbolic, as publicly displayed in great works of architecture, such as the Cathedral of Notre Dame, and its transition into the ease at which information could be cheaply mass disseminated through the printing press, I think is what he gets after the preface there. But that sounds maybe a little bit different than what you're talking about. But nonetheless, I see I see your point in the architecture as poetry reified feels like a very good image to take along in my pocket there. So, well, Eddie, thank you so much. This was a wonderful conversation. I feel the better knowing that someone out there, an additional person out there, is working to keep our culture and our traditions alive. I'm very interested, certainly, in your book, and to recommend your book to friends who might be interested. Tell us, how can our listeners continue to follow your work? Right, your book. This is just volume 1 of what it sounds like you're projecting as a series for Clark. So how can we follow you? How can we stay abreast of new developments with Aristos Books?
Well, first of all, let me show you the book. There's the book. There's Clark. Very nice artwork that they did for me. Here's reading his book on his bed. The West is the Light, Volume 1. Heed the call. The term "heed the call," the expression is explained in the book. My website is aristosbooks.com, and aristosbooks.com has links to where to buy it on Amazon or Barnes & Noble, etc. It also has links to the distributor, where you can buy the book at a discounted price. It also has information about me, the author, and my philosophy. So aristosbooks.com. Very good,
very good. And for everyone watching and listening, we'll have the link to aristosbooks.com in the description. So you can follow along with Eddie's future publications and pick up a copy of The West is the Light, Volume 1, and follow Clark's adventures with his magical history book yourself. So, Eddie, thank you so much for making time to talk to us today. It was wonderful to have the opportunity to become acquainted and to hear about your work. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Michael, for the opportunity. Have a great day.
Yes, and thank you to everyone watching and listening. We'll see you next time on 21st Century Renaissance. Take care now.